In a heart-wrenching story, a fierce fighting dog named Bruno stumbles upon an abandoned, defenseless baby while wandering in search of sustenance. For days, he has been on the move, with hunger gnawing at him persistently. His once strong and tough body, shaped by a life of brutal battles, is now beginning to weaken, but his survival instincts push him onward. Suddenly, a new scent catches his attention, a faint and unfamiliar odor that intrigues him. The thought of potential prey ignites a primal urgency within him, sharpening his focus as a hunter. He lowers his head and stealthily advances, muscles coiled with tension, holding his breath as the smell intensifies. As he draws closer, he also begins to hear something, a delicate sound that barely penetrates the surrounding silence. It is weak and fragile, yet undeniably alive. His mouth waters at the prospect, and he quickens his pace, navigating through the tall grass towards the source of the sound. Finally, he spots it. Nestled within a tattered bundle of blankets lies a tiny human being, a baby who is small and utterly vulnerable. Its soft cries break the stillness, and Bruno freezes, fixating on the infant. The alluring scent that had driven him forward was not that of food or prey. Instead, it belonged to this fragile creature that lay helplessly before him. A powerful instinct arises within Bruno, urging him to retreat and avoid succumbing to his hunger. However, another, more profound urge anchors him in place, an emotion he finds difficult to comprehend. Hesitantly, he steps closer, casting a large shadow over the tiny form. The baby emits a slight whimper, a sound that tugs at something deep within him. As his instincts clash, the desperation of hunger battles with a newfound need to protect, highlighting the complexity of emotions surging inside this once fearsome fighter. Bruno felt a powerful instinct to protect the baby, though he didn't understand where this feeling originated. As he gazed down at the infant, his fierce instincts began to wane. His body, which had been tense with hunger, began to relax as he took a step closer, lowering his head until his nose was just inches away from the baby's delicate form. He emitted a soft whine, uncertain about what action to take next, yet aware that he couldn't abandon the child. Although his hunger persisted, an overwhelming primal desire to safeguard this vulnerable being enveloped him, consuming him in a way he had never experienced before. Slowly and cautiously, Bruno settled down beside the infant, curling his large frame around it like a protective barrier. As he lay there, he could feel the warmth of the baby against him and hear its heartbeat, delicate but steady beneath the thin blankets. For the first time in his existence, he recognized that he would not be alone anymore. Bruno remained close to the baby, encircling the tiny figure with his imposing body as dusk transitioned into night. The temperature dropped, and he sensed the baby shiver lightly against him. Its breaths were shallow, and its cries had become weak, fading into faint whimpers. Instinctively, Bruno nudged the child gently with his nose, trying to transfer some of his warmth to it. The strange urge to guard this child intensified, entwining itself around his hunger and calming his survival instincts. A low growl emanated from his stomach, reminding him of his hunger, which clawed at him once again. Despite this physical discomfort and the tremors of exhaustion coursing through him, he pushed the feelings down. The baby shifted slightly, emitting another feeble cry, so soft and sorrowful that it made Bruno's protective instincts surge even more. He sniffed at the baby's face, finding its scent unfamiliar yet oddly comforting, without understanding the reason behind his reaction. Despite the tiny and vulnerable nature of the baby, Bruno felt a strong sense of responsibility for its safety. His own hunger would have to be set aside for the time being. He lifted his head, scanning the dimly lit area around him, with his ears tuned in for any potential threats. The surroundings were open and unprotected, and instinctively, he knew he had to find some form of shelter quickly. With his legs feeling stiff and tired, he stood tall, his determination unwavering. He carefully grasped the edge of the baby's blanket in his mouth, and gently lifted the child off the cold ground, moving forward cautiously. Bruno's instincts became more acute as he became aware of every sound and motion in his vicinity. He noticed the distant rustling of leaves, the soft call of an owl, and the earthy scent of damp soil. Every detail invigorated his senses while he continued on, holding the baby securely. One step at a time, he moved further into the darkening wilderness, looking for any place that could provide them with safety and rest. Despite the fatigue in his muscles and the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, Bruno persevered, focusing solely on one mission: keeping the baby safe. As night fell, enveloping the landscape in a deep and chilling silence, Bruno's legs ached from carrying the weight of the baby. His movements were slow but deliberate, as the terrain transformed from an open, barren expanse to denser underbrush and scattered trees. Each shadow seemed to flicker and change, heightening his awareness. Every small noise added to his tension, making him even more alert to his surroundings. The faint scent of water reached his nose, igniting a burning thirst at the back of his throat, leaving his tongue dry and rough. The baby, too, was in need of water, as its weak whimpers grew quieter. This only fueled Bruno's protective instincts, pushing him to move faster towards the source of the enticing smell of water. The bond between Bruno and the baby intensified as he felt a deep sense of urgency, akin to a lifeline pulling him forward. As he navigated through the thick trees, he finally spotted a small creek meandering through a dense grove of bushes. This sight instilled in him a flicker of relief, which prompted him to gently place the baby on the soft earth nearby. He then lowered his head into the cool water, quenching his thirst with deep gulps. The refreshing liquid soothed his dry throat and provided a momentary escape from the exhaustion that weighed heavily on him. After satisfying his thirst, Bruno instinctively nudged the baby's blanket closer to the water's edge before gently pushing some water toward the infant's lips with his nose, hoping to bring some life back to the little one. After a brief pause, the baby made a slight, instinctive movement towards the moisture, and as he observed this struggle for survival, Bruno experienced an unexpected wave of emotion that transcended mere duty. It was a fierce and protective loyalty that he hadn't felt since his own abandonment. For the first time, he sensed a profound connection to the child, a newfound purpose urging him to persevere. As he scanned the area, Bruno felt an instinctual pull to seek a safer shelter for the night. With one final nudge to the baby's blanket, he carefully lifted the child in his mouth once more and continued moving forward. The gentle murmur of the creek faded away as he ventured deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser, providing better protection from the wind. Eventually, he discovered a group of large rocks that formed a small overhang, creating a potential refuge. He cautiously placed the baby within the shelter of the rocky alcove and positioned himself to block any chill that might seep in, curling around the tiny figure. Closing his eyes, he surrendered to the weight of his responsibility and the warmth of the connection they now shared. Exhaustion enveloped him that night. His hunger and pain could take a backseat for the moment, as he was focused on his mission to safeguard the innocent child who had somehow come to be his own. As dawn approached, Bruno stirred awake, feeling stiff and sore from the unyielding cold of the ground beneath him. The brisk morning air crept through his thick fur, prompting him to curl up closer to the baby, wrapping himself around the little one to share warmth. The child breathed softly in a delicate rhythm, which Bruno found comforting as he listened intently while darkness faded into light. However, remaining in their current location was not an option. Bruno lifted his head, surveying their cramped rock shelter, realizing they required better protection in a more enclosed area that could guard them against both the weather and any lurking predators. A faint rustling noise caught his attention, snapping him into a state of alertness. He instinctively tensed his muscles, ready for anything, but soon discerned that it was merely a small animal scurrying through the underbrush. He let out a breath of relief, but the need to move quickly surged back within him. Gripping the baby once more gently in his mouth, he began to proceed at a cautious pace, his senses sharpened to every sound and scent around him. The trees gradually grew denser, and the air felt increasingly damp and chilly. Despite the shaking fatigue in his legs, he pushed onward, knowing that stopping was not an option. After traveling a short distance, he faced his first significant challenge, a steep hill slick with morning dew obstructing their way. Bruno paused for a moment, glancing up at the incline ahead, recognizing that climbing it would be arduous, especially with the baby clutched in his mouth and his body weakened by hunger. Yet, he knew he had no alternative. Lowering his head, he took the first careful step, his paws sinking slightly into the wet earth. With every step he took into the mud, his muscles protested vehemently, and it felt as though his body was on the verge of giving out. The additional burden, with every step he took, his muscles protested violently, and it felt as though his body was on the verge of collapse. The added weight of the baby made. As the pack of coyotes revealed themselves, they had clearly been lying in wait, and now they had caught sight of Bruno and the vulnerable baby he was safeguarding. The moment this occurred, Bruno's entire physique tensed up, and a low growl emerged from deep within him, signaling his readiness to defend. He observed the coyotes creeping toward him with their bodies low to the ground, their hungry eyes locked onto him and the defenseless infant. In an instinctive move, Bruno carefully laid the baby down behind him, placing himself as a barrier between the innocent child and the approaching predators. At that moment, his feelings of hunger and fatigue were overshadowed by an overwhelming urge to protect, igniting every sense in his being into a heightened state of awareness. The lead coyote took a step closer, baring its teeth in a menacing snarl, its eyes narrowed with fierce intent. Bruno remained steadfast, positioning his sturdy body low and ready, allowing his growls to intensify. His sharp teeth glinted as he issued a warning, yet deep down, he understood that he was at a disadvantage. There were multiple coyotes, while he was merely a single dog, weakened after days without sustenance. Despite feeling his strength dwindling, he refused to retreat, especially with the fragile child resting behind him. Suddenly, one of the coyotes lunged at him, but Bruno met the challenge head-on. He managed to snap his jaws onto the coyote's shoulder, causing it to yelp and pull back. However, just as he dealt with that threat, another coyote approached from his left, targeting his hind leg. Bruno twisted his body just in time to deliver a blow, but before he could catch his breath, a third coyote darted in, sinking its teeth into his shoulder. Bruno snarled in response, shaking his body violently to dislodge the attacking animal, ignoring the sharp pain that radiated through him. For a brief moment, he found himself encircled, with the coyotes closing in and their teeth flashing threateningly. Yet, despite the odds stacked against him, Bruno stood his ground, his growls resonating with menace and his stance unwavering and resolute. This display of defiance caused the coyotes to hesitate, particularly their leader, who locked eyes with Bruno. In that moment, something passed between them that seemed to cause a momentary pause in their advance. Bruno's steadfast stare likely signaled to the coyotes that he was ready to defend himself until the very end. Gradually, the coyotes retreated, one after another, fading back into the surrounding underbrush, their gazes lingering on Bruno before they completely vanished. Bruno remained vigilant, his eyes locked on the shadows until he was convinced they were no longer a threat. His body was sore from the confrontation, with fresh wounds causing discomfort. Dog's unwavering gaze must have signaled to the coyotes that he was ready to fight fiercely until his last breath. One by one, the coyotes started to retreat slowly, until they eventually vanished into the dense underbrush, their eyes lingering on Bruno for a moment before they disappeared completely. Bruno remained vigilant, keeping his eyes locked on the shadows until he was absolutely certain that the threat had passed. His body was sore from the The dry, soft earth near the wall provided a place for Bruno to position himself between it and the entrance. As the morning light streamed through the shattered windows, it cast a gentle illumination on the child's face. Bruno carefully adjusted the blanket around the baby, striving to create the most comfortable environment possible. His protective instincts kicked in as he observed the baby's soft and shallow breathing, with its tiny fingers occasionally twitching. A unique sense of calm enveloped him, surpassing any emotion he had ever experienced before. Bruno eased himself down next to the baby, using his body as a barrier against the chilly draft seeping through the cracks in the walls. He rested his head on his arms, allowing his body to relax despite the throbbing pain from his injuries and the insistent pangs of hunger gnawing at him. However, at that moment, the sensation of hunger felt insignificant compared to the overwhelming sense of responsibility he felt to protect the baby. He lay there with his eyes partially closed, remaining alert to every creak and groan of the aging cabin. When the baby moved slightly, Bruno lifted his head to sniff the air, ensuring everything was all right. Instinctively, he let out a soft whine, almost as if trying to reassure the child that it was safe. Time passed quietly, with the gentle light of day providing a sense of warmth as they both rested, hidden away in the forsaken shelter. For now, they were secure. Bruno remained closely situated beside the baby, his ears picking up every sound from outside the cabin. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting more soft light through the broken windows, the baby continued to sleep peacefully, its breathing steady. Bruno allowed himself to relax just a bit, knowing that, at least for the moment, they were protected. Then suddenly, the sound of distant footsteps could be heard, crunching through the surroundings. The underbrush rustled, catching Bruno's attention and instantly making him alert. His head jerked upward, and his body became tense as he began to sniff the air around him. The scent that wafted towards him was strange, but it was undeniably human. All of his muscles tightened in preparation to protect the child if the situation called for it. As the footsteps grew louder while approaching the cabin, a figure emerged from the shadows outside. A woman outfitted in hiking attire, her face glistening with sweat. Concern and confusion were etched on her features as she noticed the cabin. It seemed she had spotted it from the nearby trail and meandered over, likely searching for a place to rest. However, when her gaze fell upon Bruno, who was partially obscured by shadows, she hesitated in her stride. Bruno locked eyes with her. His stare was fierce yet held a hint of desperation. He positioned himself firmly between her and the baby, serving as a silent deterrent. The woman's eyes widened as she took in the entire scene. A large, scarred dog, battle-worn and protective, lying next to a small baby wrapped in a tattered blanket. She paused, cautiously raising her hands in a pacifying gesture. "Hey there, boy," she spoke gently, her voice calm yet infused with empathy. "I'm not here to hurt you." Bruno's fierce demeanor softened ever so slightly as he observed her closely. There was something in her tone, a soothing quality that resonated with him, reminiscent of kindness he hadn't experienced in ages. He instinctively lowered his head a bit, though he remained steadfastly positioned between her and the child. The woman carefully stepped closer, her gaze fixated on the infant. She could see that the baby was alive but appeared pale and frail, suggesting it hadn't received proper care in several days. Her eyes returned to Bruno, and it dawned on her that this loyal and formidable creature had been safeguarding the child against any threats. As her heart tightened with emotion, she felt deeply moved by the sight of his unwavering loyalty. "Is it all right if I come closer?" she inquired softly. Bruno stayed in place, but his rigid posture relaxed a little, almost as if he could sense her positive intentions. She carefully knelt down, ensuring her movements were slow and deliberate, before reaching out to lightly touch the baby's blanket. The child shifted slightly, prompting Bruno to lean forward, closely observing every action of the woman. After a brief pause, she stood up straight, her expression determined. She took out her phone and quickly dialed a number. "Yes, I've located them," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "There's a baby and a dog. You won't believe this. He's been guarding the baby. Yes, we require emergency services. Please hurry." As she spoke, she glanced down at Bruno, her eyes brimming with tears. "You did so well," she whispered gently, her voice faltering. "You kept this baby safe. You're a hero." Although Bruno's gaze remained steady, the warmth in her words ignited a sense of tranquility within him. He realized he had fulfilled his duty, and help was on the way. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt the heaviness of his fatigue wash over him. He lay down next to the baby once again, resting his head close to the small form, finally aware that it was okay to let his guard down. Just moments after the call, the distant sound of sirens broke the stillness, gradually growing louder as emergency vehicles approached the cabin. Bruno perked up, feeling a surge of energy that allowed him to lift his head and listen intently, his protective instincts still very much alive. Beside him, the baby stirred again, its tiny hands forming fists as the sirens came ever closer. The first responders approached the cabin with caution, ready to assess the situation. The presence of a large protective dog was reported to the responders, and they could see Bruno's scarred, muscular body positioned over the infant. As Bruno had been alerted that a large, protective dog was near the infant. They could see him, his scarred and muscular body hunched over the baby, as if he were safeguarding something of immense value. Bruno pinned his ears back, keeping a watchful eye on them, a low growl emanating from his throat. He was not ready to give up his post just yet. He would remain vigilant until he could be sure that the child was out of harm's way. An older paramedic, characterized by gentle eyes and a soothing voice, knelt beside Bruno, speaking softly. "Hey there, buddy, it's all right. We're here to assist." He moved deliberately, extending a hand for Bruno to pick up his scent. "You did an excellent job protecting this little one," he reassured. Gradually, Bruno's growling subsided, and his weary body began to relax as he detected the man's compassionate demeanor. He watched intently as the paramedic carefully lifted the baby into his arms, swaddling it snugly in a clean and warm blanket. The baby. The rescuers knelt down beside Bruno, placing a gentle hand on his side. "Easy there, big guy," one of them whispered softly, her tone calming as she reassured him. "You're coming with us too. You've definitely earned it." Bruno allowed himself to be led toward the ambulance, finally succumbing to his exhaustion as he collapsed onto a soft blanket that they had spread out for him. For the first time, he fully closed his eyes, feeling secure in the knowledge that the baby was now safe. Through a blurry haze, he could hear the quiet voices of the rescuers around him, filled with admiration as they talked about his bravery and unwavering loyalty. News of his heroism spread rapidly, and by the time they arrived at the hospital, a small crowd had gathered, all eager to catch a glimpse of the dog who had defied his natural instincts to protect a vulnerable child. Cameras clicked and flashed as Bruno was carefully lifted from the ambulance, while spectators spoke in hushed, respectful tones as he was brought inside. One of the rescuers gently reached out to scratch him behind the ears, whispering, "You're a hero. You know that?" Her eyes were glistening with tears. Though he was barely conscious, Bruno let out a soft huff and rested his head back down. He had accomplished what he set out to do. He had saved the child. Inside the hospital, Bruno lay curled up on a soft mat, finally able to rest his weary body. His wounds had been treated, his fur cleaned, and both his hunger and thirst had been satisfied with food and water. Yet even as he drifted in and out of sleep, his thoughts continually returned to one thing, the baby. Meanwhile, nurses and doctors worked tirelessly to care for the infant, who was malnourished but stable and had quickly become the focus of everyone's attention. Word of Bruno's protective journey had spread far and wide. The tale of survival and loyalty quickly made its way to a young couple who had recently experienced the sorrow of being unable to have children. Movith's story of survival and loyalty quickly spread, eventually reaching the young couple who had recently experienced the emotional pain of being unable to conceive their own children. Moved by the tale, they felt a strong connection not only to the child, but also to the dog involved in the story. A few days later, as Bruno lay resting, he sensed familiar voices approaching, instantly recognizable to him. He lifted his head and saw the couple coming toward him while carrying the very baby he had protected. His body tensed with excitement as his amber eyes locked onto them, especially when they gently lowered the child toward him. The infant reached out with tiny fingers that brushed against Bruno's fur, igniting a warm sensation within him, an emotion as intense as the protective instincts he had felt on that first night. The couple knelt next to him, and the woman lovingly stroked Bruno's head, her voice filled with gratitude as she whispered, "You saved our little one." She expressed their desire for him to be part of their family, declaring, "You're part of our family now." Bruno gazed up at her, feeling something profound awaken within him. This was not merely a shelter. It was a true family, a pack, and an unbreakable connection. With a soft, contented huff, he leaned his head into her hand, feeling his heart swell with a sense of belonging he had never known before. In the weeks that followed, Bruno settled into a home brimming with warmth and laughter. Each morning, he would wake up beside the baby, vigilantly watching over the child as it slept, his robust frame serving as a gentle protector. The scars from his past began to fade, both physically and emotionally, replaced by the nurturing atmosphere of his new life. He transformed from a dog previously trained for combat into a devoted guardian. His once wounded heart found healing through the very life he had dedicated himself to protecting. He no longer wandered without purpose or woke up to feelings of doubt. Instead, he found a sense of direction in his life. His mission was to look after the family he had chosen, who had welcomed him with open arms. As the months went by, Bruno became an integral part of this new family unit, and his days were now filled with tranquility, warmth, and meaning. Every morning he would lie next to the baby, who was growing stronger and more vibrant by the day, watching over the little one with unwavering loyalty. The child would laugh and reach out for him, their tiny hands playfully tugging at his ears and fur, while Bruno remained still, his gaze soft and his heart brimming with affection. On a bright afternoon, the family gathered in their backyard, where the baby was learning to walk on the grass, with Bruno nearby, attentively observing every move. The mother glanced over, smiling as she took in the sight of them together, feeling her heart swell with joy at the transformation of the dog, who had once been a fighter, into such a gentle protector. She knelt down beside Bruno, stroking his thick, warm fur, and whispered that he was a miracle. Bruno responded with a gentle thump of his tail against the ground, his eyes locking onto hers in a way that conveyed deep understanding without the need for spoken words. In her gaze, she could perceive the profound loyalty reflected in his eyes, as well as the journey he had undergone from a state of abandonment and despair to one filled with profound love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the yard in a warm golden hue, Bruno settled down next to the infant, curling up closely beside him. Together, they succumbed to slumber, enveloped in a sense of tranquility and security, cocooned by the warmth of their newfound life together. As sleep began to overtake him, Bruno's final reflections were straightforward. He felt at home and cherished. The tale of Bruno and the baby evolved into a gentle legend, serving as a poignant reminder of resilience, loyalty, and the transformative power of kindness. Bruno exemplified how love has the ability to soften even the toughest hearts, illustrating that sometimes the most unlikely connections can turn out to be the strongest.